Nobody knew who she was. That was the whole problem. It was a Tuesday afternoon in a busy shopping district, the kind of place where everyone is moving fast, heads down, nobody really looking at anyone else. Street vendors lined the edges of the block, the smell of grilled food drifting through the warm air. Shoppers brushed past each other without apology. Delivery workers cut through the crowd on bikes, barely slowing. The whole street had that particular rhythm of a city mid-afternoon, not quite the lunchtime rush, not yet the evening surge, but alive and loud and entirely indifferent to any one person walking through it. She moved with the crowd easily, unhurried, not drawing a single glance. A young woman in a gray hoodie, hair pulled back, carrying a single paper bag from a small grocery store nearby. No jewelry catching the light. No designer logo on her sleeve. No sunglasses, no entourage, no assistant walking half a step behind her. She looked, by every visible measure, like an ordinary girl running an ordinary errand on an ordinary afternoon in any city in the world. She was alone. That surprised people later, when they thought back on it. When they rewound the footage and looked again. When they told the story to someone who hadn't been there, and searched for the detail that explained everything that followed. That was always the one they landed on. She was alone. Her name was Ayako Fujitani, and two men were about to make the worst mistake of their lives. It started small, the way these things always do, quiet and almost unremarkable. The kind of opening that only looks significant in hindsight. A shoulder bump near the corner of the block, sharp enough that her paper bag swung and nearly slipped from her hand. She caught it with a quick, practiced grip, turned and offered a polite apology, kind and entirely undeserved, because the bump had not been her fault and everyone standing nearby knew it. The two men didn't accept it. One of them laughed, a short sound, more dismissal than amusement. The other took a step closer, not a dramatic step, not the kind you'd necessarily notice from across the street, but close enough, too close. The kind of closeness that carries a message that has nothing to do with distance. You should watch where you're going. The first one said. His voice had that particular edge that isn't really about the words at all. The edge that's about something else entirely, something older and uglier, dressed up in the language of a minor inconvenience. The people nearby noticed. A few slowed their pace without quite stopping. A woman near a flower cart glanced sideways and didn't look away. A teenager sitting on a bench up ahead lifted his eyes from his phone. And Ayako, she looked at them both. First one, then the other slowly, quietly, with an expression that no one in that gathering crowd could quite read. They took her quiet for weakness. They took her stillness for fear. They had no idea, not a flicker, not a shadow of a clue, who her father was, and they had absolutely no idea what she herself was capable of. What happened next would be recorded on at least 6 different phones, shared across 3 continents, and watched by millions of people who could not believe what they were seeing. Stay with us, because this story only gets more extraordinary from here. Before we get to what happened on that sidewalk, you need to understand who Ayako Fujitani actually is, because that context isn't background noise. That context is everything. She was born in 1980 in Japan, the daughter of Steven Seagal, the action film legend who built an entire career on the philosophy of Aikido, on stoic composure under pressure, on the kind of physical presence that made entire rooms shift their energy the moment he walked into them. His name became shorthand for a certain kind of danger, quiet, controlled, and absolutely certain of itself. The world knew that name. The world had seen what that name meant when it moved. But her mother's side of the story matters just as much, maybe more. Miyako Fujitani was not a background figure, not simply the woman who had been married to someone famous. She was a martial arts instructor in her own right, a woman of extraordinary discipline and quiet authority, who ran her own dojo in Osaka, who had dedicated her life to the philosophy behind the physical practice, not just the technique itself. Ayako grew up inside that world, not as a visitor to it, not as someone who observed it from a respectful distance on weekends. She grew up inside it, breathing its discipline, absorbing its philosophy. Understanding from a very young age that the point of all the training was never the fight. The point was everything that made the fight unnecessary. She didn't follow her father into Hollywood action films, at least not primarily. Instead, Ayako carved out something entirely her own. She became an actress in Japanese cinema and theater, working in a language and an industry where her father's name carried a different weight, where her own craft had to speak before anything else did. She wrote literary fiction. Her Deet novel received serious critical attention in Japan, reviewed and discussed entirely on its own merits, entirely separate from the famous surname attached to her. She built quietly, persistently, in spaces where the work itself was what mattered. But she also trained. From childhood, the principles of martial arts were woven into how she moved through the world, not as aggression, never as aggression, but as awareness, as centering, as the deep and unshakable knowledge that your body is capable, that your mind can stay steady when everything around it is loud, and that genuine fear and intelligent caution are two entirely different things that should never be confused with each other. People who knew her described a woman of almost unnerving calm, not cold, warm, in fact. Someone who smiled easily and laughed often and could hold a conversation about literature or film, or the particular difficulty of translating humor across languages. She was present in rooms without dominating them. She was confident without performing confidence. She carried herself with a kind of grounded steadiness that doesn't require an audience and doesn't shift depending on who's watching. She had nothing to prove. She had never had anything to prove. So when those two men on that sidewalk looked at the young woman in the gray hoodie and made their calculations, when they leaned in, reading her silence as submission, her stillness as the signal they were looking for, they were not just wrong about who she was related to. They were profoundly, completely wrong about who she was. The crowd that had begun to gather was growing now. People weren't leaving. Something about the particular energy of the scene, the almost eerie calm of this one woman, against the swelling aggression of the two men, held them in place the way a held breath holds. A mother shifted her stroller slightly but didn't move on. Two college-aged guys on the periphery exchanged a glance. The teenager on the bench had his phone raised now, arms steady, making sure he didn't miss whatever was coming. One of the men reached out and grabbed her arm. That was the moment everything changed. Not because she screamed. Not because she spun around looking for help. Not because panic crossed her face and gave them what they were looking for. She didn't do any of those things. She looked down at the hand on her arm slowly, deliberately, the way you look at something mildly surprising rather than something threatening. Then she looked back up, and something shifted in her expression, something so subtle that people watching the footage later would pause and rewind and try to name it, and mostly fail. A witness standing just a few feet away described it afterward as like watching someone flip a switch that nobody else in the crowd even knew existed. The man's grip loosened slightly without him realizing it. The second man said something that the cameras nearby didn't clearly capture. But whatever it was, it drew a harder laugh from the first, a meaner sound, with less humor in it than the one before. And that's when Ayako spoke, not loudly, not with any shake in her voice, not with the desperate volume of someone hoping a raised tone will substitute for power they don't have. Quietly, clearly, with the particular steadiness of someone who means exactly what they say and has never needed anyone to believe it in advance. I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to walk away. The street noise seemed to dip. The flower cart woman stared. The teenager's phone hand steadied. The mother with the stroller stopped adjusting it and simply stood still. The two men looked at each other. They didn't walk away. Have you ever witnessed someone being targeted in public? A stranger, a friend, or even yourself? Drop a comment and tell us what happened, what you did, or what you wish you had done. And let us know where you're watching from. We love knowing our viewers are tuning in from every corner of the world. What happened next took less than 40 seconds. Witnesses would argue about the exact details for days afterward. The way people always do when something moves fast, and everyone is watching from a slightly different angle, with a slightly different version of what they were sure they saw. Memory does strange things under adrenaline. It compresses some moments and stretches others. It fills gaps with what seems logical and drops details that don't fit the story the brain is already assembling. But on the 6 video recordings that eventually made their way online, the sequence is clear enough. The first man tightened his grip on her arm. His weight shifted forward, one of those postural changes that happens just before intention becomes action. The kind of shift that people who've never trained don't consciously register, but always feel. The body knows it before the mind names it. Everyone standing close enough felt it. The temperature of the moment dropped by several degrees. Ayako moved. And here is the thing that every single person who watched that footage commented on, in one form or another. In every language the video traveled through, it didn't look like what they expected. There was no dramatic wind-up, no battle cry, no wide fighting stance planted into the pavement like something from a film. There was no moment that announced itself, no visible gear shift between stillness and motion. It was precise, compact, stripped of everything unnecessary in the way that only genuine, long-practiced training produces, because genuine training doesn't add things. It removes them. Over years and years of repetition, it removes everything that doesn't work until what's left is only what does. The grip on her arm became leverage. His own force, the tightening, the forward lean, the weight he'd committed, was redirected in a rotation so smooth it looked, to the untrained eye, almost accidental, like something had simply gone wrong with physics in his immediate vicinity. He didn't fall dramatically. He didn't crash to the ground in the way movie fights require. He simply found himself facing the wrong direction, his arm at an angle that had quietly and completely removed every ounce of threat from his posture. His face registered a confusion so total, so unguarded, that several people in the crowd later said it was almost difficult to watch, not out of sympathy, but because the gap between who he thought he was 30 seconds ago and who he visibly was now was so wide it was almost vertiginous. The second man stepped forward. He stopped, because Ayako turned to look at him, just looked, and whatever she communicated in that look traveled the distance between them instantly and completely. His hands came up, palms out, fingers spread. The oldest, most universal physical language in the human vocabulary. The one that means I have reconsidered. I am no longer part of this. Whatever this is, I am done. The whole sequence, from the first movement to the second man's hands going up, was perhaps 35 seconds. The street came apart. Not in the choreographed way crowds erupt in films, not with a single cheer that builds into a roar and swells under a rising musical score. It was messier and more human than that. People were talking over each other, pointing, several of them moving toward Ayako, at once asking if she was all right, asking what had just happened, asking questions nobody was waiting to answer. The teenager on the bench was on his feet without having decided to stand. The mother with the stroller was applauding, actually applauding, with the particular energy of someone who has been holding their breath for longer than they realized. The two college guys were caught somewhere between laughter and pure disbelief, their faces doing something that couldn't quite decide which one it was. The first man, released, entirely unhurt but standing in the specific humiliation of a very public and very complete miscalculation, looked around at the crowd that had closed in around the moment. He seemed to be processing, slowly and with visible difficulty, the fact that he had been wrong about something in front of a great many witnesses who all had cameras. "Who are you?" he said. Almost every recording caught it clearly. The tone of it, not angry anymore, not aggressive, just genuinely bewildered, became one of the most quoted lines when the footage spread. People put it in captions. They used it as a punchline and as a thesis statement simultaneously, because it worked as both. Ayako picked up her grocery bag from where it had fallen during the confrontation. She straightened it with a calm, unhurried adjustment, the way you'd handle any minor inconvenience on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Then she looked back at him one final time. "I'm no one you'll want to meet again," she said, and she turned and started walking away. The crowd parted for her without being asked to. Here is where the first real twist arrives, because any reasonable version of this story ends here. The confrontation is over. The point has been made. The crowd has witnessed it. The phones have captured it. And the two men have been given more than enough information to make better decisions going forward. But the first man, humiliated and apparently in possession of less self-preservation instinct than the previous 35 seconds should have permanently installed in him, made a choice. He followed her. Hey, I'm talking to you." A hand caught his shoulder before he managed 3 full steps. It didn't belong to Ayako. It belonged to the taller of the 2 college guys, who had been watching from the edge of the crowd. A young man who had just seen everything the rest of them had seen, and had made a very quick and very clear decision about which side of this moment he wanted to be on. "I don't think you want to do that," he said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. No threat in it, just a steady, certain calm that carried more weight precisely because it wasn't loud. "I really, genuinely don't think you want to do that right now." The crowd agreed. Audibly, collectively, and without any ambiguity whatsoever. The man looked around, at the phone still raised, At the faces surrounding him, none of them neutral. None of them uncertain. All of them pointed in the same direction with the same expression. At the complete and total absence of a single sympathetic glance from any person standing anywhere in his line of sight. Something finally landed. He left, quickly, without looking back. His companion had already been gone for nearly 30 seconds, had in fact, quietly removed himself from the situation with a speed and thoroughness that suggested he had made his peace with the outcome considerably earlier than his friend had. Ayako, already half a block away by the time the second man's departure registered with the crowd, didn't look back either. Later, when the videos began circulating and journalists and commentators began reaching out to people who knew her, the question they kept asking was the same. What was your reaction when you saw the footage? The answers varied in their specifics but were almost unanimous in their spirit. Pride, said one close friend, but honestly, we weren't surprised. That's just who she is. That's who she's always been. Her father, Steven Seagal, reportedly saw the footage within hours of it beginning to circulate. He didn't release a public statement. He didn't appear on camera. He didn't post anything. But someone close to the family, speaking privately and not for attribution, offered a single sentence that ended up being quoted more than almost anything else written about the incident in the weeks that followed. He smiled. By midnight, the first video had 2 million views. By the following morning, it had 12. It hadn't been pushed by any algorithm in particular, hadn't been boosted by a celebrity repost in those first critical hours, hadn't been picked up immediately by any major news outlet, with the reach to artificially accelerate it. It spread the old-fashioned way, person to person, message to message, the digital equivalent of leaning across a table and saying you need to see this. Someone sent it to 3 people. Those 3 people sent it to 5 each. Those 5 sent it to 10. And somewhere in that exponential chain, it crossed the threshold where it stopped being something people were sharing and became something people were simply encountering everywhere they looked. Unavoidably. The way certain stories do when they hit a nerve that turns out to be surprisingly close to the surface. The clips spread across platforms simultaneously, arriving in different communities with different emphases, accumulating different captions and different contexts as they traveled. Some were shared with nothing but a single line of text. Some arrived wrapped in paragraphs of commentary. Some were clipped down to just the 35 seconds of the confrontation itself, stripped of everything before and after, which made them hit harder and faster but told less of the story. Some were shared in their longer form. The full scene including the crowd's reaction, and the moment the first man tried to follow her, which told more but asked more of the viewer. All of them spread. The martial arts communities were among the earliest and most vocal voices in the conversation, and they were precise in a way that cut through the noise productively. Practitioners and instructors posted analysis, not fan reactions, actual technical breakdowns. They identified the mechanics of what had happened, named the principles at work, explained in careful and specific language why the movement had looked the way it looked, and why that particular quality of smoothness was not a camera trick, or an exaggeration, or beginner's luck. Words like Aikido, influenced and redirectional technique, appeared in comment sections alongside phrases like years of dedicated training, and this is what the philosophy actually looks like in practice. People who had spent decades in dojos were explaining to people who had never stepped inside one what they were actually seeing, and those explanations were being read and shared almost as widely as the footage itself, because people didn't just want to watch it. They wanted to understand it, and then someone made the connection. It wasn't investigative journalism. It wasn't a formal report. It was a single post. The kind that gets written in 2 minutes, by someone who happens to know something and decides on impulse to share it. That went up on a mid-sized account and immediately started moving faster than anything that account had ever posted before. The woman in this video is Steven Seagal's daughter. Her mother is also a martial arts instructor. She has been training since she was a child. Those 2 guys had absolutely no idea. That post was shared hundreds of thousands of times before the day was out. What followed was a strange and genuinely fascinating cultural moment, the kind that doesn't happen on a schedule and can't be manufactured. That emerges only when a story arrives at exactly the right intersection of the things people are already thinking about and feeling, and haven't quite found words for yet. The discourse split, almost immediately, very visibly, and with remarkable clarity, It divided into two entirely distinct conversations that ran in parallel for days, sharing the same footage, referencing the same incident, but asking fundamentally different questions about it. The first conversation was about Ayako herself, about her composure, the specific, striking quality of it, the way it hadn't flickered at any point during the confrontation, not when the grip tightened, not when the second man stepped forward, not in the seconds after when the crowd was loud and pressing in around her. About the restraint she had demonstrated, the fact that she had attempted, clearly and explicitly, to de-escalate the situation before she ever applied a single second of physical skill. About what that choice revealed. Martial arts professionals were consistent on this point and emphatic about it. She hadn't shown off. She hadn't performed. She had protected herself using the minimum force the situation required, and then, without any theatrical pause, or lingering to receive her applause, she had removed herself from the situation entirely. That, multiple instructors pointed out with what seemed like genuine emotion, is what the training is actually for, not for the moments when you use it. For the judgment that governs when you don't. She had shown both in the same 35 seconds, which is, as more than one person noted, considerably harder than showing just one. The second conversation was about the two men, less measured than the first, more combustible. Moving quickly from the specific details of this specific Tuesday afternoon to broader and older questions about the assumptions that get made in public spaces, about women alone, about what silence means, about the particular calculation that reads stillness as an invitation, the fact that she had been alone, the fact that her quiet had been read as vulnerability, rather than simply as the natural state of a person going about their day, the fact that, after being physically outmatched and publicly witnessed, and surrounded by a crowd of people who had just watched everything happen, one of them had still attempted to follow her. That last detail kept surfacing. People returned to it repeatedly, in comment sections and in the longer think pieces that started appearing by the second day, because it seemed to contain something important about the psychology of the situation, something that the neat and satisfying arc of the physical confrontation alone didn't fully address. And here is where the second twist in this story enters, quieter than the first, slower moving, but in some ways more revealing, because the two men, perhaps believing that the internet's attention span was shorter than it actually is when something has genuinely caught its interest, made a decision. The first man, the one whose grip on Ayako's arm had been captured so clearly, and from so many angles on so many different recordings, posted his own account of the incident on social media. It was framed as a correction, a clarification, an explanation of the context that the videos had supposedly failed to capture. It was written in the tone of someone who has convinced themselves that a different framing of events will produce a different response to those events. That if you describe the same moment with different words, people who watch the same footage will arrive at different conclusions. The post did not go well. It contained specific factual claims about the sequence of events, claims that could be checked against footage that millions of people had already watched multiple times, in slow motion from 6 different angles. The contradictions were not subtle. They were not ambiguous. They were the kind of contradictions that people who have paused and rewound the same 30 seconds a dozen times do not miss and do not forget. The response was swift, thorough, and conducted with the particular energy that the internet reserves for people who underestimate how carefully it has been paying attention. Fact checkers moved through the post methodically. Ordinary viewers responded with timestamps. Journalists with nothing but time and a reliable pause button published point-by-point comparisons between the claims in the post and what the footage clearly showed. The community notes appended to the post by that evening were longer than the original text by a significant margin. He deleted it within 18 hours. But here, and this is the part that tends to get compressed in the retelling, is what Ayako herself said through all of it. Nothing, not a post, not a statement, not a single word offered to any of the journalists who were by now actively seeking comment. She did not appear on morning programs. She did not give the interview that would have been watched by millions. She did not release a message about women's safety or martial arts philosophy, or what it means to be Steven Seagal's daughter in a moment when the whole world is suddenly very interested in that question. And she went quiet, and somehow, against all reasonable expectation, that silence held steady against the extraordinary volume of everything surrounding it, said more than any press tour ever could have. One journalist, writing a considered piece about the incident a full week after it happened, when the first wave of noise had settled enough to see the shape of things more clearly, put it simply and well, she handled it in the street. She didn't need to handle it again online. That might genuinely be the most impressive part of the whole thing. This is the part of the story that the quick takes and the viral clip compilations tend to skip, not because it isn't interesting, because it's slower, because it requires sitting with something a little more textured than a satisfying 35 seconds of a bully being proven spectacularly wrong. Because it asks something slightly different of the audience, not just the pleasure of watching justice arrive efficiently, but the harder and quieter work of understanding the person it arrived through. Ayako Fujitani has spent her adult life building something of her own. That's not an unusual ambition in itself. Plenty of people born to famous parents make the same choice, draw the same boundary, insist on the same separation between their inherited name and their actual identity. But the particular texture of how Ayako pursued it is worth examining carefully, because it wasn't simply a rejection of her father's world. It was something more deliberate and more interesting than that. She pursued Japanese film and theater, working in her mother's language, in her mother's country, in an industry that operates largely on its own terms, and its own timeline, and its own set of values. Relatively insulated from the Hollywood machinery that her father's name would have opened doors inside. She didn't take those doors. She found different ones and opened them herself, slowly, through the accumulation of actual work, rather than through the acceleration that a famous surname in the right market could have provided. She wrote literary fiction. Her debut novel, Spark, was published in Japan and received serious critical attention, reviewed in publications that cover literature with the seriousness literature deserves, discussed in terms of its craft and its voice and its particular emotional intelligence, by critics who were engaging with the work on its own terms. The reviews did not lead with her parentage. The conversations it generated were about the book. That's not an accident. That's the result of years of deliberate choices about where to work and how to present yourself and what you're willing to let define you. She built in Japanese. She built in spaces where the work had to carry its own weight before anything else. And through all of it, she trained. Not as content, not as a brand, not as something to document and share and build an audience around in the way that everything tends to become content eventually if you let it. Just quietly, persistently, as a practice, as something that belonged to her private life the way certain things do, when they're genuinely important, rather than merely performed. The dojo her mother ran in Osaka, the philosophy that had been present in her household since before she had words for it, the understanding, absorbed over decades rather than learned in a single lesson, that the body and the mind are not separate systems, and that training one without the other produces something incomplete. People who knew her well, asked later to describe her, returned repeatedly to the same qualities: the calm, the consistency, the absence of any need to announce herself. A woman who was fully present in rooms without requiring those rooms to reorganize themselves around her. Someone whose confidence was so settled and so internal that it registered as something other than confidence entirely, registered instead simply as the natural state of a person who knows who they are and has stopped needing external confirmation of it. She had nothing to prove. She had arrived at that rare and genuinely difficult place, the place that most people spend their entire lives working toward and many never reach, where that was simply, quietly, completely true. So when those two men looked at the young woman in the gray hoodie and performed their calculations, they were encountering the product of all of that invisible work. Every year of training that nobody filmed, every choice to build in spaces where the famous name offered no shortcut, every morning of practice that began and ended in privacy, every lesson absorbed not as technique but as philosophy, as a way of moving through the world that had by now become indistinguishable from her actual character. They saw the hoodie. They missed the entire person inside it. And this, right here, is the thing that the internet, in its entirely understandable rush to celebrate the moment, occasionally flattens into something simpler than it actually is. Because the most important thing about what happened on that sidewalk was not the technique. Remarkable as it was, precise as it was, satisfying as it was to watch, the technique was not the point. It wasn't even really the self-defense. It was the choice she made in the seconds immediately after. She walked away, not because she was frightened of what came next, not because she was finished in some incomplete way and needed to retreat, not because the crowd's reaction had embarrassed her or the attention had made her uncomfortable. She walked away because walking away, cleanly, without theater, without the backward glance that would have converted a resolved situation back into an ongoing one, was the right thing to do. Because she had ended it. Because ending it was enough, and choosing to walk away when you are entirely capable of staying, when you have every right to stay, when the crowd would have cheered you for staying, is its own kind of strength. The less visible kind. The kind that doesn't generate the same immediate reaction, but that people who understand what they're looking at recognize immediately and remember long after the clip has stopped circulating. Her mother had built a martial arts school in Osaka on exactly this philosophy, had raised a daughter inside a tradition that was never primarily about fighting, that was, at its center, about something the word fighting actively misrepresents. The Japanese concept of eiki, the harmonizing of energies, the redirection rather than the collision, the resolution that doesn't require anyone's destruction, had been the air in the rooms where Ayako grew up, not as an abstract idea discussed over dinner, as a lived practice, as the lens through which physical capability was always understood. You train so that you don't have to fight. You develop the ability so that you can choose not to use it, and when use becomes genuinely necessary, when there is no other path, when walking away is no longer possible, and someone else's choice has removed your options, you use exactly as much as the situation requires and not one fraction more. She had redirected. She had resolved. She had walked away. Now here is the detail, the third and most significant twist in this story, that reframes everything that came before it and changes the texture of what you've already watched. Because it turns out the two men were not entirely strangers to the geography of that afternoon. Not strangers to each other. That was obvious from the beginning, but not entirely strangers to Ayako either. Not in the way that matters when you're trying to understand why she was on that specific block, on that specific Tuesday afternoon, carrying a single paper bag from a small grocery store, a detail that emerged several days after the incident, carefully, through a source close to the situation, who was deliberate about what they shared and how, was that the location was not incidental. That particular stretch of sidewalk, that particular corner of that particular shopping district, was near a community space that Ayako had been involved with for over a year. Quietly involved in the way she did most things. A youth arts program operating out of a converted storefront, small, chronically underfunded in the way these spaces almost always are, held together by the commitment of a small staff and the energy of the teenagers who showed up to it after school and on weekends. She went there regularly. She had been going there for months. And the two men, and this is the detail that landed differently for everyone who heard it. That sent people back to the beginning of the story, to watch it again with different eyes, had apparently been a presence in that area before the Tuesday afternoon that the whole world eventually watched. Not in connection with Ayako specifically, but in connection with that space, with the kids who used it, with the staff who held it together. Low-level harassment, the grinding, undramatic, never quite actionable kind that doesn't produce police reports, and doesn't make news but absolutely, cumulatively, makes people feel unsafe in spaces they have every right to feel safe in. She had known going in that this corner could be complicated. She had gone anyway, with her grocery bag, in her gray hoodie, alone and unhurried and entirely herself, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in a community that was also hers. That's the story the viral clip doesn't tell. That's the part that takes longer than 40 seconds to understand, and that changes quietly, permanently. What you think you were watching when you first saw those 35 seconds on your phone. We're almost at the end of this story now, and the final parts are where everything lands, where the unexpected happens, where you find out what Ayako did next that nobody saw coming. Stay with us. 3 weeks after the incident, something happened that almost nobody predicted. Not the journalists who had been covering the story. Not the commentators who had spent days constructing their takes and their frameworks, and their confident conclusions about what the footage meant, and what should happen next. Not the thousands of people in comment sections who had decided, with the certainty that distance and a screen tend to produce, exactly how this story should end, and what justice in this particular situation was supposed to look like. None of them saw this coming. Ayako Fujitarni walked into a community center, not the youth arts program she'd been connected to, a different space, a few blocks away, neutral ground in the most literal sense, and sat down across a table from a moderator and a small, carefully assembled group of people involved in community conflict resolution work. People who did this quietly and without recognition, who had spent years building the specific kind of trust that makes conversations like this one possible at all. One of the two men from the sidewalk was in the room. Let that sit for a moment, not in handcuffs, not across a courtroom, not separated by lawyers and formal proceedings, and the particular language that institutions use when they're managing conflict, rather than actually resolving it. In a room, at a table, with a moderator and a small group of people who believed, professionally and personally, that some things could only be addressed face to face. We want to be careful here and deliberate. Because the details of that conversation were shared in confidence, and only fragments of it have been confirmed through any accountable source. The people who were in that room have largely kept what happened inside it, which is both appropriate and, in a media environment that tends to treat every private moment as raw material for public consumption, genuinely remarkable. But the broad shape of what occurred has been described, carefully and partially, by people with knowledge of the situation. And the broad shape is this: Ayako had made it known, through intermediaries, that she was open to a conversation, not an ambush, not a confrontation dressed up in the language of dialogue, not an opportunity to deliver, with witnesses present, the public reckoning that a significant portion of the internet had been loudly demanding on her behalf for 3 weeks. A conversation, a real one, the kind that requires something from both people in the room. The man showed up. That surprised people. It surprised people who knew him, who had watched the footage and drawn their conclusions, and arrived at a settled position about who he was and what he was capable of. It seemed, from what has been carefully shared, to have surprised him somewhat as well, as if the decision to walk through that door had been made, before he'd fully caught up with all of its implications, and he was still in the process of understanding what he'd agreed to when he sat down. What was said in that room stayed in that room. That's as it should be. That's the agreement that makes these conversations possible at all, the understanding that the value of the exchange lives inside it, not in its broadcast. And that turning it into content would destroy the very thing that made it worth having. But the moderator who facilitated the meeting was asked, some time later, a single general question about the tenor of what had taken place. Not the content, not the specifics, just the feeling of it, if that could be described at all. The answer has been quoted in every substantive piece written about this story since, because it manages, in a single sentence, to say something true about conflict and resolution, and the surprising places that genuine change sometimes begins. Both people came in carrying something heavy. I think both of them left a little lighter. The youth arts program, the small, underfunded storefront space on that particular corner of that particular shopping district, received an anonymous donation shortly after the meeting took place, significant enough to cover full operating costs for 2 years, enough to remove, at a stroke, the chronic financial precarity that had been one of the quiet, grinding stressors on the staff and the space, and the teenagers who depended on both. No one has officially confirmed the source. No statement was attached to the donation, no name, no note that could be photographed and shared, and turned into a narrative about redemption or generosity, or the precise mechanism of someone's change of heart. Just the money. Arriving quietly, doing what money can do when it's directed towards something that matters. People in that community have their thoughts about where it came from. They keep those thoughts mostly to themselves, in the same way the contents of that meeting have been kept. There's a discretion operating in this story, a consistent, deliberate, almost architectural discretion, that runs from Ayako's silence online all the way through to the anonymous donation, and that feels, the more you notice it, like it might be the most intentional thing about the whole situation. This detail traveled differently than the original clip had, more slowly, more quietly, without the velocity of something that hits immediately and spreads, because the emotional payload is instant and large. It moved the way things move when they require a moment of actual thought before they land, passed between people in direct messages, rather than broad shares, sent with a short note rather than a caption designed for maximum engagement. It showed up in text messages that said, simply, I think you need to read this. It circulated in the spaces where people were still thinking about the story rather than finished with it. And in those spaces, it changed things. It sent people back to the beginning, back to the gray hoodie and the grocery bag and the 35 seconds, and asked them to watch it again, knowing what they now knew. Knowing about the youth arts program, knowing about the prior harassment, knowing about the room and the table, and the moderator's single quiet sentence. The footage looked different with that context. Not in its mechanics, those were fixed, preserved exactly as they had happened, but in its meaning, in what it was actually a record of, Ayako still publicly silent. Let the new details circulate without comment or confirmation, or any visible acknowledgement that the story had entered a new chapter. She remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, present in the situation, shaping it through her choices, and entirely absent from the performance of it. Her father's legacy is long and complicated, and genuinely difficult to summarize fairly. A career built on screen violence that he has always insisted reflects a real and serious spiritual philosophy. A real-world record that has attracted substantial controversy over the years, accusations and criticisms that exist in the public domain, and that any honest account of the man has to acknowledge. He is not, by any straightforward measure, an uncomplicated figure to invoke, but Ayako is not her father. She has never been her father. The things she took from him, the physical knowledge, the discipline, the capability, she has used in ways that are entirely and recognizably her own. In ways that the philosophy behind the training, at its most genuine, would actually endorse. She used it to protect herself, proportionately and without excess. She used it to stay in a community that needed people to stay. And then she used it, the credibility of it, the attention it had briefly generated, the unexpected leverage of a moment that the whole world had watched, to begin a conversation that nobody had required her to begin, and that served no purpose that was primarily about her. Which brings us, finally and without further detour, to what this story is actually about. It is not about self-defense, though the self-defense was real and remarkable, and worth every second of the attention it received. It is not about famous parents, though the parentage adds context that genuinely matters. It is not about the two men who have receded from the story in the way people tend to when they stop being the most interesting thing in it. It is about what you do with what you've been given, the training, the name, the Tuesday afternoon that nobody planned for, the crowd with its phones raised, the silence that followed, the room with the table and the moderator, and the person you had every reason and every social permission to never sit across from. What you do with all of it, what you choose. A few weeks after the meeting at the community center, Ayako was photographed, not by a paparazzo, not by a journalist staking out the location, but by a bystander with an ordinary phone who happened to be passing by and didn't immediately understand what they were seeing. The photograph shows the interior of the youth arts program through its storefront window. It shows a table. It shows a group of teenagers with papers spread out in front of them. And it shows a young woman in a gray hoodie, sitting among them, her head bent toward the work on the table in front of her. Nobody was filming a training session. Nobody was recording a speech. She was helping someone with their homework. The clips are still out there. If you look them up today, right now, this evening, whenever you're watching this, they're still circulating. Still appearing in compilation videos and discussion threads, and the occasional comment section, where someone has just discovered them for the first time and needs immediately to tell someone else about it. Still generating the same first reaction in new viewers that they generated in the very first people who saw them on that Tuesday night, when the count was still in the thousands and climbing. The sharp intake of breath, the leaning forward, the instinctive need to watch it again. Some things don't age out of their power. This is one of them. But what's genuinely interesting, what rewards the attention of anyone who has stayed with this story long enough to watch those comment sections evolve over time, is how the conversation around the footage has shifted from where it began. The first wave was about the physical moment itself, pure and immediate and completely understandable. The amazement, the satisfaction, the specific and very human pleasure of watching someone who built an entire interaction on a catastrophically wrong assumption be corrected by reality in real time, in public, in a way that was captured from 6 angles and could be reviewed in slow motion at anyone's convenience. That reaction was real. It was earned. It was not wrong. It was just, as it turned out, the outermost layer of a story with considerably more depth beneath it. The second wave was biographical. The research threads, the deep dives into her film work and her writing, and the novel that had been sitting quietly in Japanese literary circles, waiting for the rest of the world to find it. The discovery of her mother's dojo. The long and careful reads of her father's complicated legacy, and the equally careful reads of how thoroughly she had built her own identity, in deliberate distinction from it. People wanted to understand not just what they had seen but who had produced it. What kind of life generates that kind of response to that kind of moment? And then the third wave came, slower than the first two, less viral in its mechanics, less immediately shareable, requiring more of the people who encountered it before it would give anything back. The wave that carried the details about the youth arts program, and the prior harassment, and the room with the table, and the moderator's single sentence. The wave that sent people back to the footage with different eyes, and asked them to look again at what they thought they already understood. In that third wave, the comment sections changed, the tone shifted, the observations deepened. The conversation moved away from the specific incident, away from those 35 seconds as a standalone event, and toward something broader and harder to articulate, but clearly felt by the people attempting to articulate it. People were writing about restraint, about the difference between having power and performing it, about the communities that exist on blocks that never make headlines and the people who show up for them anyway, consistently, without an audience, about what it actually looks like, in practice, in the real and unglamorous texture of an ordinary Tuesday, to live according to a philosophy rather than simply to claim one comment, posted by an account with perhaps 300 followers and no particular platform or reach, got shared more widely than almost anything a verified account or major publication wrote about this story across its entire arc. It was not especially long. It did not contain any information that wasn't already available. It just said the thing clearly, in plain language, in a way that apparently resonated with an enormous number of people who had been feeling it, without having found the words for it yet. She could have made this about herself at every single point along the way. She never did. Not once. That's the whole story. Ayako Fujitani has not, as of this telling, given a single interview about the incident. Not one. She has continued to act, to write, to train in the way she has always trained, privately, persistently, as a practice rather than a performance. She has continued to show up to a converted storefront, on a certain block in a certain city, and sit across from teenagers who are in the complicated and demanding process of figuring out who they are, and what they are capable of, and what kind of people they want to become. She goes in the gray hoodie. She sits at the table. She bends her head toward whatever work is in front of her. Nobody makes a big deal out of it. That seems, by every available indication, to be exactly how she prefers things. There is a version of this story, a perfectly available, entirely legitimate version, that ends with a lesson spelled out. A tidy summation. A closing statement that tells you precisely what to take from everything you've just heard, wraps it cleanly, and sends you on your way with the satisfying sense of having received a complete and clearly labeled thing. We have decided not to do that, because Ayako Fujitani didn't spell it out either. At any point, in any forum, through any medium, she had more opportunity than almost anyone to deliver the closing statement, to stand at the podium the moment had built for her and say the thing that the audience was primed and ready and genuinely eager to hear. She didn't take it. And if the story has taught us anything about her, about the particular quality of the person who moved through all of this the way she moved through it, then following her example here seems like the right instinct. What we'll say instead is simply this: the people who shape things quietly are harder to make content about. They don't deliver the press conference or the triumphant quote, or the carefully timed public statement that arrives at exactly the moment everyone is waiting for it. They don't give you the clean ending. They give you a gray hoodie and a paper bag and a choice made in 35 seconds that turns out, the longer you look at it, to be the product of an entire lifetime of smaller choices that nobody filmed and nobody shared and nobody applauded. And sometimes, if you're paying close enough attention, if you stay with the story long enough to reach its quieter layers, that is the most extraordinary thing you will ever encounter on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon. And that is the full story of Ayako Fujitani, a woman who never asked for the spotlight, received all of it anyway, and handled that the attention, the scrutiny, the noise, the pressure, the opportunity to perform, with precisely the same composure she brought to everything else. Which, when you think about it, might be the detail that tells you more about her than any of the 35 seconds the whole world watched. Before you go, we have one genuine request. Not just a like, not just a share, though both of those things help more than you might realize. We want to know specifically which part of this story stayed with you. Was it the sidewalk, the silence afterward, the detail about the community program, the room with the table, the photograph through the storefront window, the comment that said she could have made it about herself and never did? More are coming. Stories with the same commitment to depth, to the layers underneath the headline, to the people who turn out to be more than anyone expected. We'll see you very soon. Tell us in the comments. Be specific. Because that feedback, the real, particular, thoughtful kind, is exactly what shapes the stories we bring you next.